The strongest people are often the ones who carry someone else's weight before anyone notices they are struggling. The cool October evening settled gently over Harbor Square in downtown Boston as hundreds of guests gathered beneath rows of glowing string lights for the city's annual Hope for Tomorrow charity gala. Local musicians filled the air with soft jazz, while families wandered between community exhibits. Children laughed near colorful booths, and business leaders greeted one another with polished smiles beneath banners celebrating generosity and innovation. Ethan Carter stood slightly apart from the crowd, holding the small hand of his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie. He had finished a full day repairing heating systems across the city before driving straight to the event because Sophie's elementary school choir had been invited to perform during the opening ceremony. His navy work jacket had been replaced with a clean charcoal sweater. Those small cuts and calluses from years of repair work remained on his hands. Sophie looked up with bright blue eyes that reflected every strand of light hanging above the square. "Daddy, do you think I remembered all the words?" she asked quietly. Ethan smiled with the calm confidence she depended on every day. "You practiced every night after dinner. I think your biggest problem will be singing louder than everyone else." Sophie giggled before giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "I only sing loud because you always smile when I do." Ethan looked down at her with the kind of warmth that only years of shared loss and unconditional love could create. "Then I hope you never stop." Across the plaza, black luxury vehicles arrived one after another as photographers gathered near the entrance. Victoria Hayes stepped out of the last sedan, wearing a simple navy evening dress beneath a long cream-colored coat. Unlike many executives attending the gala, she wore almost no jewelry beyond a silver watch that reminded her every minute seemed to belong to someone else. As the chief executive officer of Hayes Medical Technologies, she had spent the past week balancing investor meetings, hospital partnerships, and product launches while sleeping far fewer hours than she cared to admit. Her assistant, Melissa Grant, hurried beside her carrying a folder filled with schedules and speaking notes. "You have interviews after your speech, then the donor reception, then the board dinner," Melissa reminded gently. Victoria forced a polite smile. "Please tell me there's coffee somewhere between all of those." Melissa laughed softly. "Already arranged." Victoria nodded, but her eyes drifted toward the families gathered around the children's performance stage. Parents knelt to straighten jackets, adjust ribbons, and offer reassuring hugs before the music began. For just a moment, the endless pressure of corporate success faded behind the quiet beauty of ordinary life. The choir director welcomed the children onto the stage, and the first notes of a familiar patriotic melody floated through the crisp evening air. Ethan stood proudly near the front, recording Sophie's performance with an older phone whose cracked protective case had clearly survived many years of careful use. Victoria paused several yards away, unexpectedly captivated not only by the children singing, but by the expression on the father's face. There was no distraction, no checking messages, no scanning the crowd. His entire world seemed to exist within the few feet separating him from his daughter. When the final song ended, applause rolled across Harbor Square like a gentle wave. Families embraced while guests slowly made their way toward the main pavilion for the evening program. Victoria turned to follow Melissa toward the stage entrance, but after only a few steps her right foot landed awkwardly against the uneven edge of a temporary walkway. A sharp pain shot through her ankle. She caught herself against a nearby railing before closing her eyes. Melissa rushed forward in alarm. Several guests stopped walking. Security personnel looked in her direction. Victoria tried taking another step, but immediately lost her balance. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper as she looked toward the nearest person standing beside her. "Go without me," she said with quiet frustration. "I cannot walk." Ethan looked at Sophie for one brief second, then placed his phone into his pocket as the entire crowd seemed to hold its breath. What he chose to do next would stay with Victoria long after the pain was gone. For one silent heartbeat, the music, the applause, and the cheerful conversations around Harbor Square seemed to disappear. Ethan stepped forward without hesitation, his voice calm enough to steady everyone standing nearby. "Do not try to stand again," he said gently. "You will only make it worse." Victoria looked up, surprised that a complete stranger was speaking with such quiet confidence. Before she could respond, Ethan turned towards Sophie. "Sweetheart, stay close to Melissa, all right?" Sophie nodded immediately. "I will be right here, Daddy." Melissa looked uncertain. "Should I call an ambulance?" Ethan knelt carefully beside Victoria, studying the position of her ankle without touching it. Years of working inside cramped mechanical spaces had taught him how easily one wrong movement could make a minor injury much worse. "Let us get her somewhere safe first," he said. "The medical tent is less than 100 yards away." Victoria attempted another step and immediately winced. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I cannot put any weight on it." Ethan offered a reassuring smile. "Then you will not have to. May I carry you to the medical tent?" Victoria gave a grateful nod. Only then did Ethan carefully slip one arm behind her back and the other beneath her knees. With one smooth, respectful motion, he lifted her into his arms. A quiet gasp rippled through the nearby crowd. Several photographers instinctively raised their cameras before lowering them again, sensing that this was not a moment for spectacle. Victoria felt embarrassment warm her face. She was accustomed to leading board meetings filled with confident decisions. Yet now she found herself depending entirely upon someone she had never met. "I'm sorry for causing all of this," she said softly. Ethan adjusted his footing and began walking at an unhurried pace. "There is nothing to apologize for. Sometimes people need help. That is all this is." The evening breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves as they moved through the gathering. Guests naturally stepped aside, creating a quiet path without anyone asking them to. Sophie walked beside her father, looking up at Victoria with gentle concern. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked. Victoria managed a small smile despite the pain. "I think I will be because your dad showed up." Sophie beamed with pride, but said nothing more. She had heard similar words before from neighbors, elderly customers, and complete strangers whose furnaces her father had repaired during freezing winters. Ethan never treated kindness like something unusual. To him, helping was simply another part of the day. They reached the medical station where two volunteer nurses hurried outside with a wheelchair. "Thank goodness you brought her quickly," one of them said. Ethan carefully lowered Victoria into the chair, making certain her injured foot never touched the ground. The nurse began examining the swollen ankle, while another volunteer brought an ice pack and a support wrap. "This may be a significant sprain, but a doctor should rule out a fracture," she explained. "You should avoid walking tonight and have an orthopedic specialist evaluate it tomorrow morning." Melissa finally caught her breath after hurrying across the square. "The driver is bringing the vehicle around now," she said. Victoria nodded before turning back toward Ethan. "Please do not leave yet." He stopped. "Is something wrong? I never even thank you." Ethan smiled as if the answer were obvious. "You already did." She shook her head gently. "No, I did not." There was a brief silence between them before she extended her hand. "I am Victoria Hayes." Ethan accepted the handshake with the same quiet respect he would have shown anyone. Ethan Carter. There was no sign of recognition in his expression. He did not react to her last name, her title, or the whispered conversations beginning to spread among nearby guests. To him, she was simply a woman who had needed help. Victoria noticed that almost immediately. It had been years since someone had looked at her without calculating her position, her influence, or her company. "May I repay your kindness somehow?" she asked sincerely. Ethan glanced toward Sophie, who was patiently waiting beside Melissa. "Thank you, but my daughter has school tomorrow morning, and I promised her we would stop for pancakes on the way home if she sang her best tonight. I should keep that promise." With one final courteous nod, he turned, took Sophie's hand, and disappeared into the evening crowd, leaving Victoria staring after the working single father whose dignity felt more memorable than the entire gala around her. She assumed that was the last time she would see him. 3 days later, life would prove her wrong. 3 days passed, but the brief encounter refused to leave Victoria's mind. She had attended countless conferences, signed multi-million-dollar agreements, and shaken thousands of hands throughout her career, yet she could barely remember most of those faces. Somehow, the quiet HVAC technician who had carried her through a crowded charity gala remained impossible to forget. Every detail returned with surprising clarity. The steady confidence in his voice, the way he had made certain her injured ankle never touched the ground. The little girl who looked at her father as though the world had already given her its greatest hero. On Monday morning, sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Hayes Medical Technologies as employees filled the headquarters with the familiar rhythm of another busy week. Melissa entered Victoria's office carrying the day's schedule. Your orthopedic appointment is at 9 o'clock. The product review begins at 11. Investors arrive after lunch. Victoria nodded while absent-mindedly staring out the window. Melissa, yes. Did we ever identify the gentleman who helped me Thursday evening? Melissa smiled knowingly. The single father? Victoria looked slightly embarrassed by how quickly she answered. Yes. Melissa opened her tablet. I asked the gala coordinator. His name is Ethan Carter. He attended because his daughter performed with the Maple Grove Elementary Choir. Victoria repeated the name to herself. Ethan Carter. Melissa hesitated before speaking again. Would you like me to send flowers? Perhaps a thank you gift? Victoria remained silent for several seconds before slowly shaking her head. No, Melissa looked surprised. No, he did not help me because he expected anything. I think sending an expensive gift would misunderstand who he is. Melissa smiled. That sounds like him from everything I heard that night. The appointment confirmed a moderate ankle sprain. The physician instructed Victoria to wear a supportive walking boot for several weeks and avoid unnecessary strain. She accepted the advice with reluctant patience before returning to the office, where meetings filled the remainder of her afternoon. Yet between financial reports and strategic presentations, her thoughts continued drifting back to Harbor Square. Meanwhile, life continued much differently across town. Ethan spent the morning repairing a heating unit in a century-old brick townhouse before stopping at Maple Grove Elementary just before 3 o'clock. Sophie rushed through the front doors carrying a colorful backpack almost as large as she was. Daddy, she called happily, guess what happened today? Ethan laughed as he opened the passenger door of his pickup truck. I have a feeling you were going to tell me anyway. Sophie climbed inside. A new girl joined Emma during recess because she hurt her knee, and our teacher said helping people makes the whole classroom stronger. Ethan fastened her seatbelt. Your teacher sounds very wise. Sophie smiled proudly. I told her you always say kindness spreads farther than people think. Ethan started the truck, never imagining that someone familiar had just stepped onto the same school sidewalk. Victoria had arrived to pick up her 10-year-old niece, Emma Hayes, whose parents were temporarily overseas on a humanitarian medical mission. Leaning lightly on her walking boot, she thanked Emma's teacher before turning toward the parking lot. Emma suddenly pointed across the driveway. Aunt Victoria, that is Sophie's dad. Victoria followed her gaze and immediately recognized Ethan helping Sophie buckle her backpack more comfortably before closing the truck door. Neither father nor daughter noticed her standing only a short distance away. Emma waved enthusiastically. Sophie. Sophie turned, her face lighting up. Emma. The two girls hurried toward each other with the effortless excitement only children seemed able to create. Ethan looked up just as Victoria reached them. For a brief second, surprise crossed both of their faces before giving way to warm smiles. It looks like life enjoys surprising us, Victoria said gently. Ethan chuckled. Apparently it does. Emma looked between the two adults with innocent curiosity. You already know each other? Sophie answered before either adult could speak. Daddy helped her at my concert. Victoria smiled at the simple explanation. Your father was very kind to me. Ethan shrugged modestly. Anyone would have done the same. Victoria realized that he truly believed those words, and that made his kindness even more extraordinary. Their reunion looked like a coincidence, but the friendship between the two girls was about to draw their lives much closer. Over the following 2 weeks, the unexpected reunion outside Maple Grove Elementary grew into a familiar part of each afternoon. Emma and Sophie naturally found one another the moment the final school bell rang, comparing homework, laughing over playground adventures, and making plans that always seemed to include one more game before going home. Neither Ethan nor Victoria encouraged the friendship, yet neither had any reason to discourage it. It simply happened with the effortless sincerity that only children seemed capable of creating. One crisp Wednesday afternoon, the school hosted its annual family reading day in the library. Parents, grandparents, and guardians filled colorful chairs while volunteers read classic American children's stories aloud. Ethan arrived 10 minutes early carrying a reusable grocery bag filled with homemade oatmeal cookies Sophie had helped bake the night before. "Daddy," Sophie whispered proudly, "do you think everyone will like them?" Ethan smiled as he adjusted the ribbon in her hair. "The important part is that you made them to share. That is what people will remember." Across the room, Victoria entered beside Emma, still wearing her walking boot, although her ankle had improved considerably. She had left an important strategy meeting 30 minutes early because she had promised Emma she would attend. The decision had surprised several executives that morning, but Victoria no longer felt guilty for choosing family over another presentation. Emma immediately spotted Sophie and hurried across the room. "I saved you a seat," she said excitedly. The two girls settled together as though they had been lifelong friends. Victoria found herself standing beside Ethan once again. "Your daughter seems to have made quite an impression," she said warmly. Ethan looked toward the girls, whose laughter echoed softly through the library. "She has always believed every stranger is simply a friend she has not met yet." Victoria smiled. "That is becoming rare." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Maybe because adults spend too much time deciding who deserves kindness instead of simply giving it. His words lingered in Victoria's mind long after the librarian began reading. During the afternoon activity, children were invited to decorate bookmarks with encouraging messages. Sophie carefully wrote, "Always choose kindness," while Emma decorated hers with the words, "Everyone matters." When the event ended, several elderly volunteers struggled to fold heavy tables and carry boxes of books back into storage. Before anyone asked, Ethan walked over and began helping. He stacked chairs, carried supplies, and repaired a loose wheel on a rolling cart using a small screwdriver from his work bag. No one applauded. No one even noticed except Victoria, who watched from across the room while speaking with Sophie's teacher. "He does that every time," Mrs. Reynolds said with a knowing smile. Victoria turned. "Every time. Whether it is fixing a broken shelf, changing a light bulb, or helping another parent load a stroller into their car. He never waits to be asked." Victoria looked back toward Ethan as he thanked one of the volunteers before picking up another box. "Does he volunteer here often?" Mrs. Reynolds nodded. "Whenever his work schedule allows. He says schools shape the future, so they deserve extra hands." A quiet warmth settled over Victoria's heart. She had spent years listening to speeches about leadership, corporate responsibility, and public service. Ethan had never delivered a speech, yet somehow he practiced every one of those values without seeking recognition. As families began leaving the school, Sophie ran toward her father carrying 2 bookmarks instead of 1. "Emma wanted you to have this," she said happily. Ethan accepted the handmade bookmark and smiled when he read the simple words written in careful handwriting. "Everyone matters." He looked toward Emma and Victoria, offering a grateful wave before carefully placing the bookmark inside the novel he had been reading each evening. Victoria noticed the gesture and realized that Ethan treated even the smallest kindness as though it deserved to be remembered. Within days, she would see whether that same character endured beyond the familiar walls of the school. The last Saturday of October arrived with clear blue skies and cool autumn air as families from across Boston gathered at Franklin Community Park for the annual Harvest Together Festival, a neighborhood celebration sponsored by Hayes Medical Technologies to support local schools, food banks, and children's health programs. Colorful tents stretched across the park while volunteers served warm apple cider. Children painted pumpkins, and local musicians filled the afternoon with cheerful country songs. Maple Grove Elementary had organized several family activities, and both Emma and Sophie had spent the entire week counting down the days until the festival. Victoria had encouraged every participating family to attend, believing community events should feel welcoming rather than formal. Ethan parked his aging pickup truck beneath a row of maple trees before helping Sophie carry a homemade pumpkin pie she had insisted on bringing for the community bake table. "Do you think people will actually eat it?" Sophie asked with hopeful eyes. Ethan smiled as they walked toward the entrance. "Considering how much cinnamon you added, I think they will remember it for a long time." Sophie laughed proudly. "Grandma said extra cinnamon makes people smile. Then your grandmother is probably right." Across the park, Victoria greeted volunteers, teachers, and local business owners with the same calm professionalism that had made her one of the city's most respected executives. Yet unlike her usual corporate events, she found herself looking less toward the stage and more toward the families arriving with folding chairs, picnic blankets, and excited children. When she noticed Ethan and Sophie entering the festival, a genuine smile appeared before she even realized it. Emma spotted them almost immediately. "Sophie," she shouted happily before running across the grass. The girls disappeared together toward a pumpkin decorating station while Victoria walked over to Ethan. "I am glad you came," she said sincerely. Ethan nodded. Sophie has been talking about this festival every day since Monday. Missing it was never really an option. Victoria laughed softly. Emma has been exactly the same. They strolled slowly through the festival while keeping the girls within sight. Everywhere Victoria looked, Ethan seemed to notice someone who needed help before anyone else did. He steadied an elderly veteran carrying two heavy folding chairs without interrupting their conversation. He helped a young father reconnect a loose wheel on a stroller using the same small screwdriver he always carried in his work bag. He picked up scattered trash after a sudden breeze overturned a recycling bin, never checking to see whether anyone had noticed. "Do you always do that?" Victoria finally asked. Ethan looked puzzled. "Do what?" "Help everyone." He considered the question for a moment before answering. "Not everyone, just whoever happens to be in front of me." They reached a small wooden bridge overlooking a peaceful pond where ducks drifted across the water. The girls stopped to watch them while tossing small pieces of approved duck feed provided by the park staff. Victoria leaned lightly against the railing. "You make it sound so simple." Ethan watched Sophie laughing beside Emma. "Most important things are simple. They just are not always easy." Victoria lowered her eyes thoughtfully. "Sometimes I wonder whether I've spent too many years chasing achievements and not enough time noticing moments like this." Ethan shook his head gently. "You are here today. That counts." Before Victoria could answer, the festival announcer invited children to gather near the main stage for the community gratitude ceremony. As families slowly walked toward the crowd, several executives from Hayes Medical Technologies approached Victoria. Their tailored suits and polished appearance stood in sharp contrast to Ethan's simple jeans and flannel shirt. One executive offered a courteous greeting before asking, "Victoria, is this one of the contractors working the event?" Victoria glanced toward Ethan, then back toward her colleagues. She answered without hesitation, her voice calm but unmistakably proud. "No, this is Ethan Carter. He is a devoted father, a good neighbor, and one of the finest people I have had the privilege of meeting." Ethan looked slightly uncomfortable with the unexpected praise, but he simply smiled, thanked the executive for the greeting, and turned his attention back to Sophie as she waved excitedly from the children's gathering, never realizing that his dignity had already begun changing the way people around Victoria saw him. Yet the next person to underestimate Ethan would not be a passing colleague. He would be someone whose judgment carried weight inside Victoria's company. As November settled over Boston, the bright colors of autumn slowly faded into quieter shades of amber and gray, but the friendship between Emma and Sophie continued growing stronger with each passing week. Their teachers often paired them together during classroom activities because they encouraged one another instead of competing, and before long, Ethan and Victoria found themselves crossing paths several times a week outside Maple Grove Elementary. Their conversations remained easy, never forced, drifting naturally from school projects to favorite books, from holiday traditions to the small victories that made ordinary days feel meaningful. One Thursday afternoon, the school hosted a volunteer workshop to prepare decorations for its annual Thanksgiving family dinner. Parents gathered inside the multipurpose room, cutting paper leaves, arranging tables, and assembling baskets for local families who needed extra support during the holiday season. Ethan arrived directly from work wearing clean jeans and a navy flannel shirt after changing out of his uniform in the parking lot. A faint scent of fresh sawdust still clung to his hands from repairing an aging furnace earlier that morning. Victoria arrived a few minutes later after finishing a meeting with hospital administrators, still carrying her leather portfolio before setting it aside to help wherever she was needed. As volunteers worked together, Richard Lawson, a longtime member of the Hayes Medical Technologies Board of Directors, entered the room after making a donation presentation at another community event. He greeted Victoria warmly before his attention shifted toward Ethan, who was carefully reinforcing a wooden display stand that had become unstable. Richard watched for a moment before asking politely, "Is he part of the maintenance crew the school hired?" Victoria began to answer, but Ethan spoke first with an easy smile. "No, sir. I'm just Sophie's dad." The stand looked a little loose. Richard nodded with courteous indifference. "I see." His tone remained polite, yet the quiet assumption behind the question lingered in the room. He turned back toward Victoria and lowered his voice. "You certainly spend a great deal of time with local volunteers these days." Victoria recognized the subtle implication immediately. Before she could respond, Ethan simply tightened the final screw, tested the display with one gentle push, and stepped away. "That should hold just fine now," he said to the teacher. There was no trace of offense in his voice, no attempt to explain himself, and no effort to correct Richard's mistaken impression. He walked across the room to help Sophie and Emma tape colorful paper leaves onto a large gratitude tree while asking the girls what they were most thankful for this year. "My daddy," Sophie answered without hesitation. Emma smiled. "My aunt." Ethan laughed softly. "Those are wonderful answers." Victoria stood silently, watching the scene unfold. Richard eventually noticed the children surrounding Ethan, listening carefully as he encouraged each of them to write something kind about another classmate instead of themselves. One little boy frowned because he could not think of anything to write. Ethan knelt beside him and said gently, "Start by noticing something small. Sometimes the smallest kindness tells the biggest story." Within moments, the boy smiled and began writing with confidence. Mrs. Reynolds approached Victoria. "Mr. Carter has a gift," she whispered. Children trust him almost immediately. Victoria nodded. Adults probably should too. As the afternoon came to an end, families gathered around the completed gratitude tree, its branches now covered with hundreds of handwritten messages. Ethan lifted a heavy storage box onto a shelf before washing the dust from his hands. Richard happened to pass by once more and paused for a brief moment. "Mr. Carter," he said respectfully this time, "that display looks excellent." Ethan smiled exactly as he had before. "Thank you. I am glad it will serve the children well." Ethan showed no satisfaction. Proving anyone wrong had never been his goal. On the drive home, Victoria found herself thinking less about Richard's mistaken assumption and more about Ethan's quiet response. In every boardroom she had ever entered, people fought to defend their reputation, their influence, or their title. Ethan had defended none of those things. He had continued serving others with the same steady grace, and his restraint had spoken louder than any argument. Richard had changed his tone, but whether he had changed his judgment remained unanswered. The week before Thanksgiving brought the first sharp morning frost to Boston, covering neighborhood rooftops with a thin layer of sparkling white that disappeared beneath the rising sun. Maple Grove Elementary announced its annual community giving weekend, inviting parents, teachers, local businesses, and volunteers to renovate the neighborhood food pantry before families gathered for the holiday. Paint needed refreshing, storage shelves required repairs, and hundreds of donation boxes had to be organized before distribution day. Ethan arrived shortly after sunrise, carrying his familiar toolbox in one hand and a thermos of hot coffee in the other. Sophie hurried beside him, wearing oversized work gloves that looked much too big for her small hands. I can help this year, she declared proudly. Ethan smiled. You certainly can. Every helping hand matters. A few minutes later, Victoria arrived with Emma and several employees from Hayes Medical Technologies who had volunteered for the project. Instead of standing apart as the event sponsor, Victoria changed into a simple sweatshirt, tied her hair back, accepted a paint roller, and joined the other volunteers. Ethan noticed her carrying several heavy supply boxes toward the building entrance. Those are heavier than they look, he said with a friendly smile. Victoria laughed softly. You were correct. Without making a show of it, Ethan lifted two of the boxes while she carried the lighter one. Neither spoke about titles, careers, or responsibilities. They simply walked side by side toward the pantry entrance like neighbors sharing ordinary work. Throughout the morning, Ethan repaired damaged shelving, replaced loose hinges, adjusted heating vents, and patiently explained simple repair techniques to several teenage volunteers eager to learn. Whenever someone thanked him, he answered with the same modest smile. I'm already here. I might as well be useful. Victoria observed him from across the room more than once. She noticed that he encouraged every volunteer regardless of age or experience. He praised effort before results. He listened before speaking. He never rushed a conversation, even while completing twice as much work as anyone else. During a short lunch break, volunteers gathered around folding tables where homemade soup and sandwiches had been prepared by neighborhood families. Victoria sat across from Ethan while Sophie and Emma happily compared the paper turkeys they had made with younger children. After a few peaceful moments, Victoria asked gently, May I ask you something personal? Ethan nodded. Of course. She hesitated before speaking. How do you remain so patient all the time? Ethan looked down at his coffee cup for a quiet moment before answering. After my wife passed away, I spent a long time wishing life had been different. Eventually, I realized that wishing does not change yesterday, but kindness can still change today. Since then, I have tried to spend my energy on what I can still give instead of what I have lost. Victoria lowered her eyes, deeply moved by the quiet honesty in his words. There was no bitterness, no self-pity, and no desire for sympathy. There was only acceptance wrapped inside remarkable grace. Before she could respond, a volunteer coordinator hurried toward them looking worried. We have a problem, she said. Several families donated bicycles for children, but we do not have enough people to assemble them before tomorrow morning. Ethan immediately stood. Show me where they are. Without waiting for recognition or instructions, he walked toward the storage room with a handful of teenage volunteers following behind him. Victoria watched as he transformed an overwhelming task into a shared effort, patiently assigning simple jobs to everyone willing to help. Within 2 hours, every bicycle stood fully assembled, lined neatly against the wall with bright ribbons tied around the handlebars. The youngest volunteers cheered when the final bicycle was completed, and Ethan simply wiped a little grease from his hands before thanking everyone else for their hard work. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the pantry windows, Victoria realized something that no annual report, executive seminar, or leadership conference had ever taught her. Real leadership was not measured by the number of people who worked beneath someone. It was measured by the number of people who became stronger because that person chose to stand beside them. Ethan Carter did that everywhere he went without asking anyone to notice. In December, Victoria would have to decide whether noticing him was enough. December arrived wrapped in cold winds and glowing holiday lights, and Hayes Medical Technologies prepared for its annual Community Partner Celebration, an event honoring schools, nonprofit organizations, volunteers, and neighborhood leaders whose efforts had strengthened Boston throughout the year. The grand ballroom overlooking Boston Harbor sparkled with elegant decorations, but Victoria insisted that this year's celebration focus less on corporate achievements and more on the people serving others every day. Among the invited guests were teachers from Maple Grove Elementary, community volunteers, local veterans, and families who had participated in the neighborhood outreach programs. Ethan had not planned to attend until Mrs. Reynolds personally called and explained that every volunteer who had helped renovate the food pantry had been invited. "Daddy," Sophie said as she adjusted the collar of his navy blazer, "we should go because helping people deserves celebrating too." Ethan smiled at his daughter. "Then we will go." That evening, they entered the ballroom without expecting anything beyond an enjoyable community gathering. Ethan felt slightly out of place among tailored suits and evening gowns, yet he greeted everyone with the same quiet warmth he carried into every room. Sophie admired the towering Christmas tree decorated with handmade ornaments created by elementary school children from across the city. Emma quickly joined her, and the two girls wandered through the display while laughing over whose ornament hung the highest. Victoria welcomed guests personally rather than remaining near the stage. When she reached Ethan, her smile carried genuine gratitude instead of formal courtesy. "I'm very happy you came," she said. Ethan nodded. "Thank you for inviting families like ours. Sophie has already decided this is the most beautiful tree she has ever seen." Victoria looked toward the girls. "I think they made it even brighter." As dinner concluded, Richard Lawson stepped onto the stage to recognize major financial donors whose contributions had expanded several community programs. Applause filled the ballroom as organizations and executives accepted plaques before returning to their tables. Ethan applauded with everyone else, never imagining the evening would involve him in any way. When Richard finished, Victoria approached the podium carrying a single envelope instead of another award. The room gradually became still. "Tonight," she began calmly, "we have recognized generous donations, successful partnerships, and important achievements. They all matter. But there is another kind of contribution that never appears on financial reports." Guests listened attentively as she continued. "There are people who strengthen communities without asking for recognition. They repair what is broken before anyone notices. They encourage children who believe they are invisible. They carry burdens that do not belong to them simply because someone nearby needs help." Ethan lowered his eyes, assuming she was speaking about one of the many dedicated volunteers seated around the ballroom. Victoria slowly looked toward his table. "Several weeks ago, at a charity event, I injured my ankle and could not walk. Before anyone knew my name or my profession, one person stepped forward, carried me to safety, asked for nothing in return, and left because he had promised his daughter pancakes before school the next morning." Soft smiles spread throughout the audience as Ethan looked up in surprise. Victoria continued with gentle conviction. "Since that evening, I have watched him repair schools, assemble bicycles, encourage children, help strangers, and serve neighbors with exactly the same humility. He has never once asked who deserved kindness first." A respectful silence settled across the ballroom. "Mr. Ethan Carter," she said warmly, "would you please join me on the stage?" Sophie looked at her father with wide eyes filled with pride. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before walking toward the podium. He looked almost uncomfortable beneath the lights, yet his calm expression never changed. Victoria handed him the envelope. "This is not payment for kindness," she said softly enough for the nearest guest to hear. "Kindness cannot be purchased. This is our community's way of saying, we finally noticed." Inside the envelope was a certificate naming him the Community Partners Celebration Service Honoree, along with a donation made in Sophie's name to Maple Grove Elementary's Student Support Program. The ballroom rose together in a standing ovation, but Ethan did not look toward the applause. He looked only towards Sophie, whose joyful smile reminded him that the greatest rewards were found in the moments that shaped a child's heart. Yet the most important part of the evening was not inside the envelope. It was what Ethan would say when the room finally listened. The standing ovation continued for several long moments, yet Ethan remained exactly as he had always been, standing with quiet humility instead of pride. He accepted the certificate with both hands, thanked Victoria with a grateful nod, and looked towards Sophie before speaking into the microphone. The ballroom gradually became silent. "I do not really know what to say," he began with a gentle smile. "I fix heating systems for a living. Most days I am much more comfortable carrying a toolbox than standing on a stage. Warm laughter rippled softly through the room before fading into attentive silence. The truth is that I do not believe kindness is something special. I believe it is something ordinary that becomes extraordinary only because people stop expecting it. Several guests lowered their eyes thoughtfully. Ethan continued in the same calm voice. When I helped someone at a charity event a few months ago, I did not know she was the chief executive officer of a remarkable company. I only knew she needed help. If I had known who she was, I hope I still would have made exactly the same decision, because titles should never determine compassion. The ballroom became completely still. Richard Lawson folded his hands as he remembered his own mistaken assumptions only weeks earlier. Ethan glanced towards Sophie. My daughter watches everything I do. She may forget many of the words I say over the years, but she will remember how I treated people. That responsibility matters more to me than any award ever could. Sophie smiled through shining eyes while Emma gently squeezed her hand. Ethan looked back across the audience. My wife used to tell me that every person we meet is carrying something we cannot see. Ever since losing her, I have tried to remember those words every single day. We cannot always remove another person's burden, but sometimes we can make it a little lighter simply by showing respect. A deep silence settled over the ballroom, not because anyone had been asked to remain quiet, but because every heart seemed unwilling to interrupt the moment. Ethan finally lifted the certificate slightly before speaking again. I accept this on behalf of every parent working 2 jobs, every teacher staying late after school, every volunteer who cleans up after everyone goes home, and every neighbor who chooses kindness even when nobody notices. Those people are the real reason communities become stronger. When he stepped away from the microphone, the applause returned even louder than before, yet Ethan walked directly towards Sophie instead of lingering beneath the lights. She wrapped both arms around him without saying a word. Victoria watched the quiet embrace and realized that this simple moment carried more meaning than every carefully planned speech delivered that evening. After the celebration ended, guests slowly made their way through the hotel lobby overlooking Boston Harbor. Snowflakes drifted gently beyond the tall windows, covering the city in peaceful white. Richard approached Ethan before leaving. Mr. Carter, he said sincerely, I owe you an apology. When we first met, I judged you far too quickly. Ethan smiled with the same warmth he had shown from the very beginning. Thank you for saying that. We all make quick assumptions sometimes. The important part is deciding what we do after we recognize them. Richard extended his hand, and Ethan accepted it without hesitation. Ethan had carried no bitterness into the exchange. Outside, Victoria, Emma, Ethan, and Sophie paused together beneath the glowing holiday lights. Thank you, Victoria said quietly. Ethan looked puzzled. For what? She smiled gently. For reminding me that leadership begins long before someone receives a title, and respect begins long before someone earns recognition. Ethan glanced toward the children laughing as they tried to catch snowflakes in their mittens. Maybe the children already knew that, he replied. They all stood together for a peaceful moment as the first real snowfall of the season settled across Boston. The city moved around them with its usual noise, hurried schedules, and endless ambitions. Yet within that quiet corner of the evening, something far more lasting had taken root. A working single father had never asked the world to notice his dignity, but because he chose grace over recognition, service over applause, and kindness over status, the world had finally become still long enough to see it.